Welcome to this Zoom, this Zoom meeting. I'll be handing over to Maureen Robinson in a moment. The one person that isn't on at the moment is Diana.
She's just joining.
Ah, hello, Diana. Bear with me a moment, Stuart. I just wanted,
no problem.
Please. Diana.
Hello, Martin.
Good evening.
Good evening, Martin.
Hi, Diana.
How are you?
Hi, Miggy. Hi, Diana.
Hello, Wendy. Hello, everyone. Hello, Maureen.
Good evening.
Nick and
Mr. Cabana's just sneaked in.
Woo.
I thought I'd make a mention of that as it's John. Anyway, less of that. Diana will be saying a few words about subs, but that won't be now. We'll get on with the main thing this evening, which is Stuart's presentation. So I'll hang over to Maureen Robinson.
Hangover.
Yes.
Remember those.
Yes.
how many of us are there?
So,
Even though Martin has welcomed Stewart, I was going to say hello to everyone. And before I welcome Stewart, I just wanted to point out that his talk will comprise of 4 sections. Questions can be asked after each section and at the end via the chat icon on your screen and via Neil. Just to make that clear, that if you think of a question, just send it to Neil via the chat icon. So therefore, I'd like to welcome RPS photographer Stewart Wall as a friend of the club and known to fellow RPS members. I'd also like to welcome another RPS friend, Robert Herringshaw, Leslie, a keen photographer who lives in Ainhoe and wanted to join us this evening, and Richard Hall, another friend of Stewart's. So very briefly, Stewart started, I hope this is all correct, Stewart. Stewart started his career as a press and photographic journalist in 1978. After many years of taking photos in various fields, he decided in 2015 to cement his knowledge by taking a degree with an MA in photography. Interestingly, his focus was on the Industrial Revolution and how it affected the manual worker. For the last 3 years, his interest has developed in urban street photography, which he is here to talk to us about this evening. So with no more ado, over to Stewart and Neil.
Thank you, Maureen. Are you taking over, Neil?
You can. You're ready to screen share when it's convenient to you.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maureen. Yeah, you were fairly close in 2015. Yeah, that was probably me.
It wasn't.
Yeah, it's probably me misinforming you. No, in 2015, I'm not sure whether I would call it a decision, really. I just kind of wandered into a university building and kind of had a chat with a tutor who said, do you want to start on Monday? And I said, oh, okay. Thinking I was actually going to walk into a fine art class. Yeah, and the young tutor asked us all to do an 8-page layout using actually, give you an idea, just muted their Zoom so that we don't get the echo. Are you getting an echo?
I'm getting an echo at the moment.
And Stuart, I can't see you. All I can do is see the club members' faces, which are delightful.
Okay, so if you're on a PC or a Mac,
I'm on a Mac.
Okay. So Neil, are you to Mac? What you need to do is change it to speaker view or gallery view. Are you up on Mac, Neil?
That's on speaker view now.
What are you seeing at the moment, Diana?
I'm seeing everybody. I'm seeing a little bunch of everybody.
Okay. That's something you need to do your end, Diana.
Yeah, but I'm not sure what. It normally comes up that I can share screen.
No, it's on a PC. It's in the top right-hand corner where you change to gallery view or speaker view.
Diana, if you're on a MacBook,
I'm now
if
being
you're on
more
a MacBook, you want to share screen.
Paul Burton, I can see hello, but I can't see.
Hello.
I'm now getting, sorry about this. This is embarrassing. I should be able to do this.
So do
Diana, go
speak
to
of
the
your
top right-hand
gallery view?
corner.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm top right-hand corner.
Gallery view or
Gallery view. I've got everyone.
Or
and
An
speaker
arrow
view.
there. Click on the arrow.
No, it's not an arrow on a
I
Mac.
haven't got an arrow.
I've got an arrow.
No,
Max have arrows. Yeah, the top.
mine
Who's on a Mac?
is. I am.
Yes,
I
I am.
am. Go to gallery view.
Yes,
Press gallery view, and it will then change to speaker view.
I'm on speaker view. Yeah, I can see
There
speaker.
again. So if you stop speaking, it'll go to Stewart when he starts speaking.
And now you're speaking, so I can see me.
Yeah. So I'm going on to mute. If everybody goes to mute, then
We
it
should all mute.
can't interrupt Stewart.
I'm going to
I've
mute,
now got-
No,
mute everybody.
Yeah, you do that, Neil.
Neil mutes every.
Right, okay, I think, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me, everybody?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. Are you okay, Diana? Are you on there?
Yeah, I'm back online.
Oh,
I do
that's
have problems sometimes.
no problem. I love your advertising, by the way, Wild Axe Motorhomes. Just
Oh,
behind
right.
you. You're
How did
charging
you
them
stumble
for that.
across that?
It's right behind you.
Oh, that's the manual pack. We've got a motorhome.
Yeah, it's very good machines, aren't they?
We've got a lovely one. We're looking forward to using it again
Yeah.
soon.
Apparently Zoom has expanded so much. On average in March, 300 million individuals are using Zoom every day. So I think you can negotiate a good bit of advertising fee for that. And as with Wendy, with a SB700 box behind us, you can talk to Nikon and get some advertising revenue for that. So, so just come back to where I was. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Maureen. In about 2015, I wandered into a university building and decided to do a degree, which I thought was going to be in fine art, but it turned out to be design. And I did 2 years doing design, and during that time is when I engaged with architecture. And then I finished that BA honours in photography, went on to do an MA and then a PGCE. So, but if I go to share my screen, if that's okay, and we'll just start. So what you should see now is just a screen of me reflected on the floor. Is that sort of? Can you give me a thumbs up, or Neil, are you unmuted?
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. So, as Maureen was saying, in 1978, my mother actually applied for a job for me on a newspaper. I was actually still at school doing A-levels. I don't really make many decisions in life. Things just seem to happen. And I wandered along to an interview on the Brentwood Gazette in Essex, and was offered the job because I was the only applicant with at least 5 O-levels. And we needed that because they were going to send us off to college. And that was kind of my introduction to the world of photography. I was doing a level in photography at the time, so I had an interest, but I'd never really planned to be a photographer. I was really more interested in technical drawing. So I did a couple of weeks because it was the Easter holidays, and I intended to go back to school, but I really enjoyed it. So I went into school on the Monday and said I'd like to leave. And since then, I've been taking photographs and making a sort of living out of doing it. So street photography, just for a moment, street photography is a hobby that a lot of people do. If I just go back to that opening screen, you'll see at the bottom where it talks about the flaneur. If anybody's heard of the flaneur, it's somebody who just saunters around taking a view of society, really, just observing society. And it's a term often used in photography to refer to a street photographer who just wanders around. But going back to those press days, I always look for stories. And this image here is where I was looking for the spirit of the city. It was actually a Royal Photographic Society competition, if you like. Not that we do competitions, do we? But it was a competition to capture the spirit of the city. And I'd kind of seen this chap walking down the road, and he looked quite grumpy, and I just thought, I wonder if he will give me a funny look as he walks past. And you can see that he did. This was just me wandering around. I am drawn to demonstrations, and that probably goes back to my press photography days, because I used to do quite a few stories along those lines. So what I'm going to do today is go through, as Maureen said, a series of different projects. The first one is talking about the press photography. Then I'm going to talk about Daniel Meadows. I don't know if anybody's heard of Daniel Meadows, but it was Daniel who really changed my way of viewing photography. Then I'm going to go on to the stonemason, which was a project that I did in around about 2015, and which I put forward for an associate distinction with the Royal Photographic Society. Park Hill Streets in the Sky. I've been there numerous times, and I'll talk about that. Casbah Central Hall is the project I really did through the BA that went into the MA, and then at the end we can have general questions. As Maureen said, at the end of each section, we'll have a couple of questions on each section. So if you've got anything in mind, please use the chat room here just to send that to Neil, and then Neil will ask those questions at the end of each section. So this is what I've just been going through. So you can see from 1978, I joined the Essex Chronicle. I really enjoyed that job, and I only left because I thought if I don't, I'll be here forever. And I joined the Evening Gazette, which was an evening paper in Colchester. I really enjoyed the buzz of a daily newspaper, and eventually left quite quickly to then freelance for newspapers like the Daily Express, the Sun, and the Telegraph. I did that for a few years, but I got pigeonholed as a hard news, standing outside court buildings. And I'm not sure whether that was really me, so I did move on. I joined the Royal Photographic Society and joined the Contemporary Group. That was in about 2004, and I'm currently the regional organiser. That date is a little bit out. I think it was about 2015 that I took over as the regional organiser there, and I currently sit on the licentiate distinction team and sit on the distinctions committee. So that's my engagement with photography, if you like. Now these are a few pages pulled out of the work that I did as a press photographer. You might recognise the guy on the end. On the left-hand side, that's quite a fuzzy photograph of a character called Mike Reed. He was in EastEnders and on the Comedians. He threw a punch at me outside the Chelmsford Crown Court. You might also recognise the chap in the middle, Enoch Powell. Now Enoch Powell, you'll know the history of Enoch Powell. He came to Billericay in Essex in 1978, and I'd only been on the newspaper for a few months. It was June and I started in April. So I was 17 years old. Nobody else really wanted to go and photograph Enoch Powell, so they sent me, the office junior, and I had quite an interesting afternoon. I do then remember going back home and asking my dad what it had all been about. So although I'd got an O-level in government and politics, the school hadn't really taught us about Enoch Powell, and Dad didn't really want to get involved in it. But that kind of started me asking questions about politics and how they affect us, society. And then on the right-hand side was a screenshot or a newspaper snap sheet of a project I was sent out to do. I'd upset the chief photographer, so he sent me out with the Billericay Twins Club to Colchester Zoo for the day, which I actually quite enjoyed. There I was, a sort of 17-year-old youngster being sent out with all these young mums with their children. It was great fun. So this was the sort of stuff that I would do as a press photographer. After I left press photography, I then began doing a lot more commercial photography and also street photography. And you can see here, the picture on the left is just me wandering around Colchester in Essex, doing a bit of that flaneuring I mentioned to you just photographing people walking by. And then on the right-hand side, that's actually a wedding that I photographed. I have photographed about, I think we worked out it's about 3,000 weddings since 1975. And I will often take the couple out on the street. So I use the same street photography techniques with the wedding couples. And they really like that. And often wedding couples will book me for that street photography aspect. So let's just talk about social documentary street photography. What do we mean by that? Well, I think this is where you take your street photography, you stop that flaring, and you start to think about what you're actually doing. Towards later on in the evening, when we start to talk about Park Hill and then move on to the Casbah Central Hall, especially the Casbah Central Hall project, I was reflecting on my days working for the newspapers, where often the editors would write the headlines and then send us out to get the story to fit the headlines. I wanted to look past that and actually look at how architecture and humans react to each other. And this is where the social documentary aspects come into my work. I'm interested in how we live. So you guys down in Beddington and Adbury, you seem quite a sort of jovial lot. You seem to be bouncing. I'd be quite interested in what that's all about, what sort of lives you live. East Marsh in Grimsby, which we'll come on to, that was the area I focused my degree work on. You can see that it actually crosses into lots of different areas, so anthropologists, geographers, historians and writers. There's quite a few different aspects to social documentary street photography, and hopefully you'll see that as we go through the evening. So this is Daniel Meadows. I'm going to show you a few images of Daniel Meadows, and then I'm going to play. In fact, I just need to stop sharing for a moment and reshare, because there is a video and I just needed to click the sound button. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. Okay, so are you back to the photograph of Daniel Meadows?
No.
Okay, let's stop sharing again. Are you back to it now?
Yes.
Ah, fantastic. So obviously what you're seeing here is a composite, so it's 3 different images of Daniel Meadows. Daniel Meadows was a photographer who in the 1970s was at Manchester Polytechnic with people like Martin Parr, who you might have heard of, and Charlie Meacham and Brian Griffin, studying photography. When he left Manchester Poly, he then bought a double-decker bus from Barton's of Melton Mowbray and went travelling around the country photographing strangers, and you'll see some images of that bus in a moment. And I just found that really fascinating. And when I went down to see him, I just phoned him up and introduced myself. He lives down in Monmouth. He said, we'll come down for the day, and we spent a day chatting about what he'd done. But during that talk, he said, everybody wants to go back to that project on the bus. My life just keeps revolving back to it. So I created this image with 3 different photographs of him to show how he just has spent his whole life going round and round in circles in a way, but actually he's done some marvellous work. So I'll just touch that screen for a moment. So this is the bus, JRR 404. And after tonight's talk, if you go onto the internet, or if you get bored of me, you can go onto the internet during the evening and just put in Daniel Meadows, the photo bus, and hopefully you'll find Daniel's website. Now, what Daniel did was he not only took photographs, but he also recorded people talking to him, and we're going back to the 1970s. And you'll be amazed, because I guess some of us and a lot of us were about in the 1970s, and I think you'll struggle to recognise the voices, the way people were talking, the way that people were dressing. And this is why social documentary photography, I think, is so vital, because we are documenting today for the future people to look at, to get an idea of how we lived our lives, sat in a Zoom room with screens behind us. All of this is quite vital stuff. So JRR 404 was his bus. Now, he sold the bus after he finished his project in the 70s, and we managed to track it down. Daniel didn't know where it was, but through the great internet, I managed to track it down to a museum just outside Birmingham. So the day before we went to see Daniel, my wife Shona and daughter Jessica, that's Jessica in the picture on the right with the golden hair, we travelled down to the museum at Whittle, and we had a look at the bust. We arranged to go, and they allowed us to photograph it. And then we turned up at Daniel's house. The photographs were on the back of my Olympus EM5, and he was amazed that it still existed. It really was quite a reunion. This is Daniel at home. You can see all the pictures on his wall of the project. That's his wife on the left, telling him to listen rather than talk, I think. I'm not sure why she did that, actually. I just thought it was a nice photograph. You can see on the right all the news cuttings and the story, this photo bus. It really gained a lot of interest. As he travelled the country, he had a lot of stories published in the national newspapers, and he developed a lot of interest for him. People would literally come along and he would take their photographs. He had a retrospective at Birmingham a couple of years later, and we went along there, and it was the first time I really saw his photographs blown up, and I was amazed at the quality of them. He used a Rolleiflex to take his photographs, and the print quality was just amazing. It really was very, very impressive. A Rolleiflex twin lens reflex. I've got a Rolleiflex twin lens reflex, and the first time I used it was I'd been asked if I wanted to photograph some weddings. I was a press photographer. I was about 18, 19 at the time, and I said, yeah. I went along and saw a chap called Eddie in Epping. This was at National Weddings, and he said, bring along your medium format camera. Well, I didn't have one, but I said to the chief photographer, have you got one? And the newspaper had stopped using Rolleiflexes, so he gave me a Rolleiflex 2.8 twin lens reflex. It was beautiful. I had to take a portrait of Eddie. That was my interview. And he phoned me back the following day and said, stunning portrait, absolutely love it. Do you want to do a wedding on Saturday? And I was sat there on the phone thinking, I don't think it was beautiful, Eddie, because I've worked out that I put the film in the wrong way round. But anyway, I did do the wedding, and I carried on shooting for them for quite a while. So this is Daniel at his home, and he's quite a tall chap, like myself, and this is him at his iMac. I'm just going to start this video. If you sound is quite low, so you might have to turn your volume up. It lasts a few minutes, but this is Daniel talking about contemporary and documentary photography, which is what I was asking him at the time. What is contemporary photography? So, Neil, if the sound isn't playing, can you shout up quickly?
Okay.
Is that okay?
They started to happen, and the Hayward Gallery put on a show of Bill Brandt's work. Bill Brandt was Britain's most, well, he and Cecil Beaton probably were the two most famous old style photographers before, you know, Bailey and his lot came along. It's interesting that the exhibition was actually put together by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and so the Arts Council had to hire it from the Museum of Modern Art in New York to put it on in London, of Britain's most famous photographer, Bill Brandt. And I went to that show, and I just thought it was the most wonderful thing, being to be a photographer. He seemed to walk through, don't worry, I never answer the phone. He seemed to walk through many different people's lives using his camera as a kind of passport. It seemed to me that the camera could be a passport into the lives of strangers, and that's what I was interested in. I wanted to meet lots of people. And yeah, so yeah, and then I thought, oh, I could be a photographer, that would be cool. And the only place that would take me was Manchester Polytechnic, so that's how I first went to the north of England.
Excellent.
This is the June Street set that Martin Parr and I did together. This is also on Vimeo. This is public on Vimeo.
That's fantastic, isn't it?
This is a bit longer, this film. This is what I call a digital story. In other words, it's not a talking picture, it's me talking, not the people in the people, not the people in the...
In 1973, I was a student at Manchester Poly. This is my friend, Martin Parr. Together, he and I photographed the residents of June Street in Salford. 20 houses awaiting demolition. What attracted us was that it had been used in the filming of ITV's Coronation Street. Alive on the telly, in reality it was about to be erased from the map. So we were curious. Which version was the true version? The quality of the city's housing stock was a big story at that time. The Manchester Evening News had published a damning shelter report on conditions in Salford under the headline "Condemned Property, Condemned People," and our project drew the attention of the BBC. A researcher came to record the voices of the June Street residents and edited them together with our photographs for an item on Look North, the Tea Time magazine programme. They paid us £10. It was before the days of video recorders, so I've no tape to show you, but I find I do have this faded photostat of the script. Here, June Street residents talk about their worries and weigh up the pros and cons of the move. That being stuck in a flat in a tower block, they might not see anyone for days on end. That it'll be nice having a bath, but miserable without an open fire. That with the walls in the new flats being painted white, they won't be allowed to decorate them. That because the council doesn't allow dogs, they'll be made to have them put down, which will be expensive. But at least I can take my memories with me, says one of the old-timers. No one can take those from me, can they? In time, these photographs became a part of Salford's collective memory. And in 1996, for another BBC programme, I returned to the city and met up with the Craddocks. Here they are, Kim, Alan, Joan, Barbara and Jacqueline. Then and now. Or rather, then and then, for photographs are always in the past. Right, now here's an older couple.
Oh, there's Barry and Bill, both died.
Are they?
Yeah.
They lived facing us, didn't they?
Yeah, they was at the end on that side.
They,
On this side.
they had a fire one night. I think it was about 12:30.
Oh yeah, bad fire,
The man at the shop
Jack.
phoned fire brigade and the butcher was in the window.
Hey. Oh yeah, the poor butcher.
Yeah.
He died.
You know the bay windows?
Yeah.
Well, telling the bay windows.
Yeah.
We've seen the curtains first.
Yeah.
If they'd gone any further, the house would have been up.
And did they move out after that then?
No.
No, they just boarded the bay up and they lived in it. But the poor butcher. What a shame.
Sometimes I think that if I've spent half my life taking pictures, then I've probably spent most of the other half trying to work out what those pictures mean. The digital age has made a difference, of course, for now, when photographs are exhibited, gallery goers blog about the pictures and tell us what they mean. When Fluff Rick visited the National Media Museum in 2011, he wrote that my 1970s pictures reminded him of a time when it felt like being working class and from the north made you the natural enemy of the people running the country. Tricky Mum wrote that in this street full of interiors with families seated in their living rooms, she spotted an example of nearly every carpet, curtain, wallpaper, gas fire and sofa owned by ourselves or those we knew at the time. Cries of, "Mum had that carpet," and so on, filled the room. We recognised it all and were only astonished that we'd forgotten quite how much pattern we all squeezed into one room in those days. The Key to Hell blogger spent half an hour in floods of tears. There were front rooms with budgerigars and tights drying over the fireplace, lonely women with hideous wallpaper and hearth sets. All the details of my teenage years were there to be seen, and I crumpled. That something so rooted in a specific past can speak so powerfully in an ever-changing present and with such a range of meaning is, I think, magical. The lesson of June Street is that there never was and never will be one true version. There are many versions. People laugh, people cry. But as I know only too well, not every set of pictures can deliver quite like the June Street pictures deliver. And that, of course, is what's so riveting about being a documentarist.
So if this is contemporary, it's because I'm using today's perspective to look at a body of work and see what it's meant down the years. As most documentarists make the work, stick it in the archive and that's it. Or stick it under the bed, you know. And maybe it gets published once and that's it, all done, or exhibited or something. What I've tried to do is to trace a body of work and to see how its meaning has shifted down the years. So it really intrigued me that there were so many people voluntarily blogging their enthusiasm for those photographs and for all the different reasons that they talked about. Some of them laughed and some of them cried.
So having spoken to Daniel, he kind of led me to see photography in a completely different way. And over the last 8 weeks, while we've been in lockdown, I've been doing exactly what he was talking about there. I've been looking back at the thousands. I take a lot of photographs, as you probably all do, and I've been looking back to see what they all mean. And as we went through that video, you'll probably have remembered back to your lives when you had that same sort of furniture maybe and the same wallpaper. It transports us back to a different era. So at this point in time, 2015, when I'd spoken to Daniel and spent a fantastic day with him, I drove away thinking, what shall I now do? So I think, Neil, were there any questions on what we've just looked at? Or?
Not yet, no.
No? Okay, so we'll move on, shall we? Unless anybody has got anything that they would like to ask at this point.
Could I ask something, Stuart?
Of course, Nick.
Hi. That's very interesting. I'm fascinated by sociology as well, but I just wonder, what do you think is the effect of pointing a camera lens at your subject? Because don't you often find people freeze up, or they put on a pose, or they just lose their naturalness?
I think, Nick, you're absolutely right, and photographers have tried to think of their way around this for a long, long time, and I don't think there is a way around it. People will change how they act as soon as they see a camera. The chap in that first photograph that I showed you when I was photographing the shop, I never made eye contact with him. I very rarely do when I'm taking street photographs. I'm usually doing something else. So I was photographing the shop. He was my target, and I'd seen him 100 yards up the road thinking, he won't walk behind me, he'll walk right in front of me. I know he will. And sure enough, he did. And as he did, he sort of looked at me, but he was still reacting to me. But is that the story itself? Is that what you're actually photographing? Are you photographing the reaction of the person to you?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, really. That's a fact in itself. You're absolutely right.
Because it is that interaction which I find really interesting. I find it interesting how we build houses to suit ourselves, and then how houses change the way that we live and how people react to each other. You're a very friendly club with the looks of things, and somebody within the club will be the catalyst of that maybe. This is how societies work, don't they? Does that sort of answer your question in that respect?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, Diana.
Question from Colin.
Hello there. I was wondering if Daniel Meadows is still working as a photographer.
Yes, he is. Yeah. When I met him, he was suffering. His mother died at around about that age from MS, I think it was, and he started to suffer from MS himself. He seems a lot better now, and he's been doing projects through in the Black Country with one of the photography associations up there, and I often see him with Martin Parr. Martin Parr's academy, of course, in Bristol, across the way from the Royal Photographic Society. So I think, yes, he is. I don't think he's quite as active as maybe some of his contemporaries. So Brian Griffin, who's 5 years older than him, seems to be, not at the moment, of course, but doing jobs all over the world. So at sort of 70, 71, Brian is extremely active. Yes, most definitely still taking photographs. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Neil, was Diana looking to ask a question?
No, that's it for now.
You're muted, Diana.
Yeah. Right. Hello, Stuart. When you started flaneuring and street photography in the 70s, did you find it easier then than now? Because people had an honest enthusiasm for having a camera pointed at them. Now everybody thinks it's going to go on Facebook and you're going to make some money out of it. There was people didn't have cameras and they were flattered that you were paying them attention.
I think there's definitely been a change. You're absolutely right. As a press photographer, turning up at an event, everybody would gather round you. They'd be really keen to have their photograph taken. And there was a definite magic about photography at that time. I mean, I was paid a very low wage on the newspaper. I seem to remember it being about £30 a week. But I'd taken an £18,000 mortgage out, and you don't pay an £18,000 mortgage on £20 a week sort of thing, £25 a week. But we were selling 10 by 8 prints from the jobs that we were doing. And I can remember one job where it was a bowls club and 200 people ordered a photograph at £1 each. That was like sort of 10 weeks' wages in one go. People don't order prints anymore because they all take their own on the iPhone.
Yeah.
I don't find a problem doing street photography, if that's what you're getting at.
It's more the enthusiasm of the person doing. In the past, I sense that people would be almost flattered. They would be there and they wanted to engage with you. Now they just sort of quite dismissive.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, things do change, don't they? I mean, my mother used to.
Have you found that?
No, because I do in a way. Yes, you're right. But I just kind of crack on with what I'm doing. Very often, really along the lines of what Nick was saying, I quite like it that they almost ignore me and let me get on with it, because I do want to try and get something a little bit more natural than people posing for me. You still do get people posing, and I think there'll be a photograph later on where one person was quite keen to pose, but he'd had a few cans of whatever they drink, black lightning or something, is it? Whatever they drink anyway. Lovely, thank you. No,
thank you.
So if we move on, so the stonemason, I wanted to do something as a project for an associate distinction for the Royal Photographic Society. When I first joined, I had no interest in doing distinctions, but then I realised it would be beneficial. So I did the licentiate, and then I was looking for a project. At the time, a lot of photographers were flying off to Cuba and all over the world to do projects, and I wanted to do something a little bit more local to me. And that's my studio on the left-hand side. And this chap, Colin, would walk past the studio twice a week. I knew exactly when it was. He would walk past on a Wednesday and then on a Saturday morning at about 10:15. And I started talking to him. His 10:15 Saturday morning trip was to the co-op to get his week's shopping. And I started chatting to him, and he was a really interesting chap. And at the time, we'd lived in Caister, which is in Lincolnshire, for about 3 or 4 years, and I realised that people didn't really escape Caister. They seemed to sort of move there and just never move out. It was like the Bermuda Triangle. And I said to Colin one morning, "How long have you lived here for?" And he said, "Since 1886. And I thought, well, that's a long time ago. So I started chatting to him, and it turned out that he was the local stonemason, and his father and his grandfather before him had all worked from the same 12-foot square room, making Masonic heads, you know, sort of graves and things like that. And I just thought, this is the story that I want to tell. Colin, at that time, was late 60s. He's never married. He's never had children. So unfortunately, when he retires, that will be the end of the business. unless he sells it on. But as he says, everything's gone computerized now, so not many people will want to chip away on stone. But yeah, he agreed for the project. This is his 12-foot square room. He does own the house and other buildings around it. This is where all the work has been done since the 1880s. So I started taking photographs. I didn't really have to do that many sessions with him. I think I went back 3 or 4 times, but he was absolutely fantastic to work with. The way he worked with material, of course, as you can imagine, he's been doing this for a long, long time. And his skill was just incredible. He spoke me through the process where he's drilling holes in the stone. He's then chipping it out, filling it with lead. He went through the whole process, which I photographed as we went along. If you're interested in camera equipment, I was using the first Olympus EM5 to shoot these on, mainly with a 17mm lens. He then showed me how he then sort of painted the names in and scraped away all the stuff that he puts on, putting gold leaf onto it. And at this time I was thinking, well, how do I put together a panel of 15 images, which is what you do for the associate distinction, to really make it quite an interesting panel. And it was this work, this how he worked, that I was looking to do documentary. At the time, he was put in the professional applied section, but it would now be in the documentary section. These tools absolutely fascinated me. Every time I asked him to, you know, if I could photograph the tools, he would then want to clean them. And I said, no, don't clean them. And there was tools that he hadn't touched for over 20 or 30 years. He just walked past them each day. But these are the tools that he uses, and his father and grandfather behind him. If you just look in the top left-hand corner of my photograph, you'll see another picture on the wall, and I'll just refer to that in a few minutes, but just remember that picture there. So these were the tools. I've got some close-ups, and you can see these shadows, these cobwebs hanging from them. That was all part of the story that I wanted to tell. And then he had all these bits and pieces everywhere. This just made me think of all the ancestors and people looking down on him. These are the tools. You'll recognize some of those tools. This was quite an interesting photograph because I could not actually get this this image with this depth of field because the room was so small. But I wanted to demonstrate control of depth of field, and that's actually 2 images, so I cheated. I couldn't get the depth of field that I wanted, so I took one photograph, focused on the foreground, and then another photograph throwing the background out a little bit more, and then in that magical Photoshop, join them together. Now, you might call that cheating, but actually I read the other day, they've been cheating since the start of photography, because in the 1880s, there's some marvelous interior shots from photographers showing fabulous detail inside, but also the outside, and the film just wasn't capable of recording both. So ever since almost the birth of photography, they've been merging negatives together. So what we do in Photoshop is nothing new. I've got Colin looking out of the window, which was quite interesting because at this point in time, Colin said to me, what's your surname? So I told him, and at this time he did rub some dust off the windows. That glass in that window frame has been there since his grandfather bought the business in 1880, and there was my name. It was sort of like a G wall. His grandfather had bought the premises off somebody with the same name as myself. That's him outside in the property, and if you look over on the left-hand side, you'll recognise that building. That's my studio, so you can see how close he was. He literally is my neighbour across the road. So you don't have to drive miles or fly miles to find interesting stories. They are on your doorstep. In my studio, I was shooting portraits like this. So this is sort of kind of examples of my professional work. People jumping up and down, families coming in. And the reason why I'm showing you that is because that was the sort of work that I was doing at that time in my studio. And that photograph that was on Colin's wall, I said to him, "Is that your family?" And he said, no, it's not. When my grandfather started the business, to earn some extra money, he was shooting family portraits in front of the house. And that was in the 1880s. So I thought that was quite an interesting coincidence. Colin's never used a computer, so I don't think he'll be one of the 300 million using Zoom. Everything is done with a pen and a phone. And he's got paperwork going right back to the beginning of the business, 1899, look. And he found all these in a room that he hadn't been into for 50 years. And I said to him at the time, "Have you got any of your grandfather's cameras or plates or anything?" He said, "No." He said, "When I went into that room, we did find some glass, but we threw it away. And we think that was probably his glass negatives." I thought, what a shame, what a shame. Colin has been going on holiday to the Isle of Wight since he was a boy, and he still goes to the same place on the Isle of Wight, and he always stays with a family. And I found this a fascinating story. He started going with his parents, and then as one family died out, another family inherited Colin. So he's been going to the Isle of Wight on holiday all those years to different families. He kept the record, so this was just a fabulous list of names and history of our local Caister. And these are pictures of his mother and father going on holiday to that Isle of Wight that I've just mentioned. So just from that little morning's talk at 10:15 on a Saturday morning, it opened up so many different stories for me to actually capture as a nugget of social documentary. And this is his album of those images. We then went off to the graveyard, and I realised this is actually his family's portfolio. This is his work. And as we walked around, he was able to show me how the design of headstones has changed, and he knows who made what, and whether it was his grandfather or his father. I mean, it's just quite intriguing. And these are things which I'd never really thought of before. We kind of just drive past graveyards without really thinking about them. And here he is keeping his own father and grandfather's graves clean, really. So that's Colin. The actual work, the local newspaper wanted to publish stories on it. There was 3 different newspapers who put pictures in there. They found it sort of quite a fascinating story. And by now I'd really got into it, and I wanted to do more with it. I'd gained the distinction. That was successful. Oh, that's the window, by the way. That's where it's sort of on the right-hand side. That's where my name was scribed into, not my name, but somebody's name from history. And I then decided to hold an exhibition, or ask if I could hold an exhibition. And when I first did ask the Caister Arts and Heritage, they said, yep, in about 3 years' time, if that's okay. And then suddenly there was a cancellation, and they wanted the exhibition within about 6 weeks. So I managed to reprint it all and get it all ready. And along we went. And it was a real success. A chap called Robert Herinshaw travelled up from down your area. I'd never met him before, but he was quite interested in doing an associate himself. And on the opening of the exhibition, there was over 300 people there, apparently. It was packed. And throughout the month of January, when they're normally very quiet, it pulled in a lot of people. So the Arts and Heritage were happy, I was happy, but I wasn't happy. I still wanted more from it. And I thought, well, I've got this exhibition there for a month. What can I do with it? So I then started talking to people and getting their stories. These 2 chaps here are brothers. Unfortunately, the one on the right, he's died now. But they worked on the local dustbins. They were bin men in Caister. So the stories they were able to tell me was absolutely fascinating. And I've been working on those recently. These are Colin's neighbours. The lady in the middle, she was a lady farmer. So in the 1930s, I think it was, she went to college to study farming. And again, I found that quite fascinating, because at that time, I don't think there were that many lady farmers about. Unfortunately, I never really got to tell her story because we arranged for me to go round and talk to her. Unfortunately, she passed away before that happened, but I think that would have been fascinating. The children loved it, and that gave me an idea. I thought, I wonder if I can get the schools there, and that proved to be quite a problem at first. Caister has got 3 or 4 schools. Already mentioned the Industrial Revolution earlier on, and when the thresher arrived, that changed the locality, and instead of using the children to work on the farms, they then started to build schools. So there's actually 3 or 4 schools in Caister, and there's only 3,000 people in Caister. So I thought, well, I wonder if I can get them there. And after a series of phone calls, I did. So that's my daughter in the middle. That's not me embedding maths, by the way, which as a teacher I'm meant to. That's them looking at the gold foil that Colin has just put on their fingers. And some of them said, we're not going to wash our hands again, which obviously our current Prime Minister wouldn't be very happy with. But they found that fascinating, the value of gold foil. I did a few lessons there, and that was really where I started to get quite interested in teaching, which is why I've now done a PGC, and I'm teaching not at junior school, but I'm teaching in colleges, photography and whatever. Colin loved it as well. He was quite sort of reserved about talking to a group of school children, but actually really enjoyed it because they found him fascinating, I think. They loved the idea of asking questions like, how much does a stonemason earn? How much does a photographer earn? It really was they were excellent sessions. The grammar school came along, and that really pleased me because Alicia, the teacher there in the middle, she said to me afterwards that they were just doing their options, and 3 of these decided to do art as an option because they'd been along to the exhibition. And that just kind of pleased me somehow. So that was the stonemason project. As I say, I put it forward for a distinction, the Royal Photographic Society, which it was successful. And it really sort of taught me, that introduced me into this concept of social documentary. So if we just stop for a moment for any questions on the stonemason, are there any coming through, Neil, at all?
I haven't had any yet.
Okay, anybody want to ask any questions before we move on? Come on, you've got to think about some questions. So we'll let you off on this section, but the next section, get some down on paper. So, excellent. Park Hill. Now, Park Hill came about, and it was really a game to do with the Royal Photographic Society. We were talking about deadlines. As a press photographer, we worked deadlines, and somebody said to me, yeah, it's okay for you, Stuart, you can work deadlines, but we're amateur photographers, we can't. And I thought, well, you can, because catching a bus is a deadline. So we set the first day up as an experiment. Park Hill Streets in the Sky, if you've never heard of it, was social housing in Sheffield. There was 1,000 flats on 13 floors designed to house 3,000 people. Social housing was a very sought after form of property at one point, and the government and councils used it to put workers where they were needed. And this was in the centre of Sheffield, and obviously at that time you had places like Sheffield Steel and a lot of factories needing employers. So I arranged to go, I think it was on February the 26th, 2015, and I went with 11 other photographers. We all turned up at 10 o'clock and had a bacon sandwich at the Hard Hat Cafe, and then we all went off to photograph Park Hill in whatever way we wanted to do it. So there was no requirement to photograph it in a specific way. Then the deadlines came in. If people wanted the photographs in the book, they had to get them to me within, I think it was a week. And then I would have the finished first book within 2 weeks after that. Now, somebody said to me, how many photographs should we send to you? And I said, well, maybe between 20 and 30, not really expecting everybody to send their photographs in to me. Everybody did. And most people sent me 30 photographs. One person sent, I think, 16, but most of them were up to the maximum. And when I looked at them, I thought, well, I could edit them down, but I don't really want to because people have really thought about their work. So you can see it's quite a thick book, that first book. There's 300 pages in it. And the projects are really interesting. Some of the photographers, one lady, for example, photographed the dark shadows and the light areas of the concrete. Park Hill was based on something called brutalist architecture, which is where the concrete is left exposed to the elements. You've probably heard of brutalism. It's all based on something Le Corbusier designed, looking at reinforced concrete and hoping to create a utopia for people to live in. I found that quite fascinating, and that's what I studied for the degree. So you can see here, this is Park Hill. This is the 13 floors. This is obviously this is a picture I took in 2015. Again, I found quite an interesting link there because my mother was born in Sheffield, and Mum and Dad had moved literally a couple of years before I was born in 1961, which is when they opened. And I often thought, well, maybe we could have ended up living there. So it was a fascinating area, and this nursery is still open now. It's still running now, and it was then. And this is one of the oldest nurseries in the country, the Grace Owen Nursery. Because the whole idea of these complexes was you could live there, you could go to school there, you could buy your food there, you could work there, all within one complex. Everything was there for you. And I'm going to play another little video to you which kind of explains this in more detail. So turn your volume up.
Park Hill Estate was designed by architects Jack Lynn and Ivor Smith for Sheffield Council. When it was completed in 1961, it offered the world a bold new solution to the post-war housing shortage.
After the war, there was obviously a need to build a lot of houses, and the typical model was to build high, to build tower blocks. That didn't give you very much social diversity and gave you a very standard plan. And here, this is really the start of thinking about how else to do it. The unique feature here were external streets. Narrow passageways had been used before, but they gave problems with privacy. But here, they used a complex system with a wider street, so that it was more like an area to pass the time of day with people. They also allowed different sorts of flat size, which gave you social diversity. And the designers here were really trying to recreate the idea of a social mix, of a street life, of an active community. And that's really what sets Park Hill apart. People do have strong reactions to Park Hill. Some people say they love it, or a lot of people say they hate it. But we try not to take that sort of emotional response to architecture. We're really looking at its place in the long term. The government listed the building at grade 2-star, which puts it among the top 6% of historic buildings in the country. And really that's a recognition of its role as the international model in housing design. At the time, England led the way, and people came from all over the world to see this development.
English Heritage are playing a key role in preserving Park Hill and are adopting what's known as a constructive conservation approach. This allows less important elements, such as the brick cladding, to be modernised, whilst ensuring key design features like the concrete frame are preserved.
When Park Hill flats were designed in the mid-1950s, it was actually relatively unusual to expose the concrete structure on the outside. And so here it was fairly sort of bold to produce this concrete grid, which actually the flats sit within, which regulates the design and is the strongest design element. So therefore that became the focus of our conservation efforts, to make sure that that was repaired in an appropriate manner. Some of the concrete is pretty good, but other areas have deteriorated due to exposure to the elements. And so you've got areas where the concrete's falling off and exposing the reinforcement, and the reinforcement is rusting. I mean, for example, here you can see the reinforcement bars showing through the surface of the concrete.
Restoring the concrete frame to its original condition is vital if Park Hill is to retain the essence of its brutalist design.
The concrete will be repaired by cutting out the areas of damage and then casting in new concrete, which will imitate the original surface treatment, so that you can see a trial repair there where an area has been cut out and the board marking on the concrete has been imitated, and even the graining, so that the hope is that the repairs won't be too obvious when we've finished.
It's been essential at Park Hill to partner conservation with creative design solutions. To achieve this, English Heritage have worked closely with Sheffield Council and an experienced historic building developer, Urban Splash, who began work on site in 2007.
So Urban Splash you've just heard mention, and I'll come on to that in a moment, but they were really interested in the book that we produced. Tom Bloxham, who heads them, looked at the copy and then decided to blog about it. And eventually I was sending copies of the book all over the world. So this is a colleague of mine, David Shapiro. He came with us on that first project, and these are those passageways. A milk float could drive down those. So one of the ideas of it was that a milk float could drive in one end and then go from each block. There were 5 different blocks with these streets in the air, from one block to another, and deliver milk to all 1,000 flats. There was 1.5 miles of these passageways. It fascinated me that behind every one of these closed up doors a family had lived. And when we had that bacon roll in the Hard Hat Cafe, we spoke to the girls there, and they said, oh yeah, we grew up on Park Hill, as did our aunties and uncles. There was extended families, whole extended families who lived in the complex. Must have been a really quite an interesting way of growing up. I found some residents. This chap, he didn't speak English and I didn't speak his language, but he'd lived there for 25 years in 2015. And he stopped and posed for a few photographs and then walked on. Later on, I did go back and I did go to a residents meeting, and the chap said, oh yeah, that's my father. So I did get a little bit of information on him. These are the, I took this one because it kind of put an age. You can see that this one was taken obviously at some point after 2005, so I was trying to put some sort of date stamp on the photograph with the car registration. I think social documentary, that's quite important. And also there were some young people living there as well. And you'll see in a moment when we go on to the latest project where they're now building student accommodation in one of the blocks. This was a builder at the time, obviously. And you can see this architecture, this exposed concrete which they're retaining, and that's what it's all about. A lot of this brutalist architecture throughout the country is being demolished. Robin Hood Gardens, for example, in London has now gone. Park Hill, that structure was got heritage listing, and that's why it survived. It's quite a fascinating building. This was a lady called Anna. If I just go back to the stonemason for a moment, at that opening I was talking to that art teacher from the grammar school, and I told her about this project, and she said, oh, one of my ex-students lives there, I'll see if she will let you in. Well, the ex-student couldn't because she was working, but she put me onto this lady who's called Anna Hartman, and she let us in, and that gave us a different perspective. Rather than just photographing the outside of the building, we could now photograph the inside. These were some of the photographers who came with me, and as you can see, she was quite happy to pose for them and talk to us about the whole complex. Now, at that time, I wondered if she would forever live on a building site, because you see here, these are the 5 different blocks, and I just kind of thought it would take forever to do, but it doesn't seem to be. They're really getting on well with it. They're getting on well with it because the rail line runs right outside it, and at that 2015, the new high-speed train was due to go past it. Obviously, we're not sure what's happening with that at the moment, but the idea was that you could be living there in Sheffield and get to London within an hour and a half. Whether we need to go to London much now with this new Zoom world that we live in, I'm not sure. You can see how close, and obviously this was one of the trams taking into town centre. So it really was quite an interesting place to photograph and probably to live, although it is very Marmite. I think some people, as that said in that BBC programme, hate it, and some people quite like it. But the ground surrounding it, really fascinating. Obviously, this was just a link to that Sheffield Steel, where my grandfather had actually worked. But this was part of Park Hill's downfall. Sheffield Steel became mechanised, so lots of people were made redundant. And then Margaret Thatcher, obviously, and her government sold off a lot of social housing. So suddenly, whilst everybody had been in the same situation at one point, suddenly you had people renting, people owning, people working, people not working, and the structure really fell down. But the views over town, over the city, are beautiful. So bring it up to date. Literally, I think it was again February. It was the same day, February the 26th this year. So it was just before all this pandemic kicked off. I went back with 14 photographers. So in total, there's been 25 of us in total go over the 2 visits. So there's now 2 books showing a lot of different approaches to photographing it. And again, this time we were invited in. I phoned Tom Block, or I didn't phone him, I sent him a message on Twitter saying, could we come back and take some new photographs? And he immediately said, yep, I loved your book, you're more than welcome to come in. And when I got there, whereas everybody had been saying it would never work, suddenly the whole place had changed. He'd really done what he said he was going to do, and that was renovate those blocks. You can see the gardens now. I don't know if you can remember that earlier picture where it was just a building site. They're now quite structured. And there's this garage in the middle, the black building, is now an art centre. And they're really aiming the whole structure at designers, artists, students. They really have got an interesting plan for it. It has changed. The picture on the left is from 2015. Picture on the right from 2020. This graffiti seems to almost be like Banksy's art, and it's all over the place. So they're kind of trying to make it a funky place to be, and there is a lot of it. A lot of these sort of colourful paintings, which really gives it a sort of presence. The nursery is still there, although it has moved. So even within 5 years, we could see big changes to this area. This is quite a famous I Love You, Will You Marry Me? It used to be over one of the bridges, I think, and what they've done is they've moved it inside and preserved it. And the passageways have changed. What they've done is they've narrowed them because I don't think the milk float goes by anymore, to make the living accommodation bigger. And this chap invited us into his flat this time and showed us around. And instead of being a sort of, was it blue collar worker, sort of manual workers, he's a vet or manages a veterinary practice. So you can see that the sort of jobs that people are doing who live there have changed. He's also a musician. And it was quite interesting talking to him and capturing his story. And then we were actually invited into the actual works themselves. Now this particular block is being converted for students. They were working very rapidly to get it ready for September. I'm guessing that the pandemic has changed that schedule quite a lot. And we were invited in, and we all had to sort of get donned up in sort of helmets and protective stuff. And we were taken into the very depths of the building to see what they're doing with it. And then this chap pushed past literally the week before the pandemic, and I found that was quite a sort of poignant image, really. It just made me, the following week when it all kicked off, I thought back to this photograph that happened on there. So the Park Hill story does continue, and at the moment I'm working on a talk where I'm looking at how all those different photographers approach this project. And I think that's quite an important aspect of photography, especially when you start to dig past just taking scenic images, because every photograph that we take is based on our own experiences. And then when we look at those photographs, we view them based on our experiences. So the message changes. And I think what's coming over in that is how all these different people came up there. And Wendy and Robert and Richard were all on this project. And when you see their work, it's all completely different. So I think we're coming up to a break in a moment, but have we got time for a few questions on that, Neil?
We have. We haven't been asked any, but if anybody's got anything to say.
I've always got a question.
I was wondering, Nick.
I love that last shot. In fact, looking at a lot of your pictures, just to give my background, I grew up in Africa. So if I had to do what you did there, it would take an enormous amount of courage. I'd run out screaming because, you know, the brutalist is very brutal to my perspective. But one thing I like is the way that you use the perspective lines.
Are we talking about this one here, Nick?
Well, I'm coming on to that. But a lot of your other pictures have got, like this one, have got the really striking perspective lines. But then we get on to the last one, and I always struggle when I've got a picture like that. What do you take as your key vertical? Because you're looking up at a building, aren't you?
Yep.
And you've inevitably got that vertical sort of distortion of perspective.
Yep.
If you were to sort of straighten that out in Lightroom, it would look really weird, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah.
So you've chosen, and yet to me, the is it the sort of stair shaft, which is just off center, is leaning to the right. It's a great picture. So how did you come to put your verticals like that, to choose that axis of rotation?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is you've analysed the photograph really quite well. Yeah. And you've really looked at that image. And I think maybe, I mean, if we go back to my commercial photography days, I had a camera called a Sign RP2, which was a 5x4 camera. And doing architectural photographs like this, we would get every vertical and every horizontal perfect using the front and back panels. But actually, they're not really like that, are they? Because when you look at something, they do converge upwards. Obviously, what we've got here is it's almost leaning over as well. Yeah. So to answer your question, the only really upright bit is that right edge of that sign, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I think in answer to your question, I wasn't really that worried. I was looking at all the colours, the way that they were running, but it was that sign that I wanted to photograph. And in all honesty, I probably didn't even stop as I took it. I was just talking to somebody as I walked past it, saw the sign, thought I must get that, and took some photographs and moved on. In Lightroom, you're quite right, I could have corrected it. But it seems to just work for me in the way I look at it, because it is about those colours. What does it do to you, Nick, when you're looking at that photograph? How does it make you respond to it?
Yeah, I like it. I think you're right. The colours are the big thing, aren't they? But I think, to me, the big black square,
yep.
It's kind of, it's like gravity. It actually is tipping the picture over to the right. And that's why it looks balanced, because actually there is a weight on the right that's pulling it over.
Yep.
So it's a kind of dynamic thing. That's the way I perceive it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it would be slaughtered in the camera club competition or any competition. But it kind of tells the story there. I mean, I mentioned earlier on that there's 13 floors.
Yeah.
You would never realise it, because where it's built is on top of a hill. Park Hill, the story of Park Hill goes back centuries. Gangs used to gather there because they could see the peelers running out of Sheffield City to get them. So they liked the vantage point. And Park Hill, when they first built it, when they built this building, or these buildings, they named those corridors after the streets that had been there before. So they originally started to clear what was known as a slum area before World War II. World War II came along and disrupted that, and then of course afterwards there was a lot of building. But when they first opened it in 1961, and they've retained this, they tried to call the corridors in the block after the roads that had been there before to try and keep that community. But because it's on such a hilly area, they've kind of dug into it so that the roof line is level, even though some of them are 13 floors, some of them aren't, and they're all on different levels. So it is quite a sort of leaning over type building, but obviously in reality it doesn't.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have another question from Colin.
Yeah, this isn't directly relating to just this project, but I was wondering, Stewart, if your projects always run consecutively, or whether sometimes you have them running concurrently with more than one going at once.
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably do have them all going on at the same time, really, and I keep returning to them. Do you know what? I forget where I heard this, but only recently, where somebody said, of course it was, her name slipped. It'll come back to me in a minute. But she said, think of your next project when you're about 3/4 of the way through your current project. So you don't have that time where you've got nothing interrupting you in the middle. And I think she's absolutely right. And I think probably this is a hangover from my newspaper days and also commercial days, where I've just got loads and loads of different work going on all at the same time. I do the same thing now. When I started going through the projects I've done in the 5 or 6 years, it amounts to loads of them. And I just thought, how did I get those all done? So maybe I just can't make my mind up, so I just do the whole lot. Yeah. Do you work in projects yourself, Colin?
I don't, and I should do, really. It's something I should start to try to focus my photographic activities in that way, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think people should do what they want, really, but I quite like the idea of working in projects because it gives some context to your work. One of the things we get asked of the Royal Photographic Society quite often is, especially when people want to move on to do an associate level, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do.
Right.
Well, obviously projects is what it's all about, so yeah.
Yeah, so if you're used to working in that way, I guess it becomes a whole lot easier to try to go for one of the higher distinctions then.
Yes, I think it would, because it gives you some context to what you're trying to achieve. So yeah,
Yes.
definitely is worthwhile doing. And I think the book concept is a good idea as well. If you think around about the idea of doing a book, I mean, if we just go back to Daniel Meadows for a moment,
yeah,
he was just photographing what was normal at that time. So June Street was the way people lived. So if everybody looks around the room that you're sat in at the moment, that's the normal way of living at the moment. But it won't stay like that. Things will change. If you think back over the last sort of 40 or 50 years and the different houses that you've all lived in, they were all different. So document your own house. It might not be interesting to society now, but it might well be in 30 years' time. So on your doorstep. So there's projects all around you.
Yeah, good tips.
Excellent.
And the question from Maureen Robinson.
Hi, Stewart.
Hello, Maureen.
Hi, I was just wondering, do you know if Urban Splash have done any other interesting building projects?
They have, yeah. Urban Splash. I mean, Tom Bloxham was on the richest list at one point as a property developer. And what they do tend to look for, it seems to be, is properties that councils have a problem with. So Sheffield Council couldn't get rid of the structure there because it was listed. but Sheffield Council didn't have the funding to actually renovate it. So Urban Splash came in, and probably they were sold, I don't know, for £1 or something, just to take it off their hands. So that seems to be how they work. And if you go onto their website, it's really fascinating. There's projects all over the country. One that springs to mind is in Manchester by the canal, which they've recently done. I don't know whether they tend to be more northern than southern. I'm not sure, but definitely have a look at their website, Maureen. You'll find it fascinating.
Are they therefore quite altruistic in their approach to housing and the people who they would eventually like to inhabit these flats?
I think they are, yes. They're very, I mean, Tom Bloxham you would call more of a socialist than anything, really. He wears a sort of like pork pie hat and is quite proud of his heritage as a bit of a barrow boy type thing. Very, very, very clever chap. If you put his name into Google, he's done some TED Talks and things like that. He's got an OBE now for his work to building, and he does look for. Yeah, I would totally agree with you. He's looking for different societies to move in. So here we've got designers, artists, professionals, but also there's a block being given over for student accommodation as well. And there will still be, I think it was 200 social flats there out of the ones living there.
Good to know.
Yeah. So, got another hand up there, Neil, if that's okay. I don't know what your order is.
Sorry, Neil.
We'll be the final one. Martin's calling for a break.
Can I just ask one question? We're actually quite familiar with a couple of the locations that you've been talking about. My question is, do you find the people in different locations, whether it's kind of semi-rural Essex or rural Lincolnshire or urban Sheffield, are they different with you as a photographer? Is there any discernible difference with the people?
I think people are. I think very, very much so. I mean, if I talk about commercial photography for a moment, people respond to prices differently. So to sell the same product in Lincolnshire is one price. It's a higher price in Essex, and it's double the price in South London. And that's not because I'm trying to charge people more, it's just that if I charge South London prices in Lincolnshire, nobody buys, and if I charge Lincolnshire prices in South London, nobody buys. So there is a perception on price. As a photographer, in London, if I'm taking street photography, nobody really bats an eyelid at you. They're all doing it themselves. In Lincolnshire, they'll kind of look at you out the corner of their eye. Whereas in Sheffield and places like that, they'll probably stop and talk to you. But not sort of say, what are you doing? But say, what are you doing? Because they're interested. Is that the sort of things you were meaning, David?
Yeah, it was. Well, we're from Sheffield, and
excellent.
We were living in Stock in Essex when you were on the newspaper.
Yep.
And, we found that people in Essex didn't talk to you, especially not as freely, and especially if you went into London.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's in a rush, aren't they? I have clambered along to the end of the sails on the Stock windmill.
Yeah.
So, the sort of thing that the editor would do is if he knew he'd got some blank pages, he would send one of us out to take some photographs. So I can remember going to Stock, which was just outside Biddericke, of course.
Yes.
And what we would do is go to the local pub and pick up some stories there. And the Stock windmill still had some sails on at the time. And when I got there, I don't know whether they were renovating them or something, but I can remember ending up sort of climbing to the end of them, which was a bit unnerving. So how long did you live in Stock for?
8 years.
Was it? Yeah. Beautiful area, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a bit different from the pit villages of near Sheffield. So
Yeah. So, excellent, nice to hear.
Thank you.
So, excellent. So, did you say it's coffee time, Neil?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So, how long did you want to stop for,
Martin?
Start again at 9:10, please.
Fantastic. Is that okay with everybody? Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, lovely.
Thanks very much. Brilliant. So part 2, I'll go back onto sharing screen if that's okay. So can you see the chap holding the 2 books?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I mentioned the name Martin Parr earlier on, and that is Martin Parr. So you can see the 2 books there, The Stonemason and Park Hill, which are the projects that I've been talking about. Martin Parr, if you ever go to the Royal Photographic Society building in Bristol, do make sure that you go on a day when Martin Parr's Academy is open. He has got the most marvellous set of photo books. There's always a super exhibition there. And these 2 books did end up in his collection somehow. They are on his shelves. Martin Parr, of course, has got one of the biggest photo book collections in the world, really, and it's something that he really does promote. So the next project that I looked at, and this was happening between the, to answer a question earlier on, this was happening between the Park Hill projects, was the Casbah Central Hall. And this was something that I started doing whilst I was doing the BA degree. As I say, I started off doing design for 2 years and then switched to the University of Lincoln for the final year, which was the photography degree. I think I suddenly remembered that I was actually a photographer and I ought to do my degree in photography. So I needed a project, and to begin with, I was going to look at a Northern Council estate called Nunsthorpe in Grimsby. That was a council estate designed and based on the Garden City concept of Ebenezer Howard, where again the idea was that you can live, work, go to school, do your shopping all in one area. And I was busy doing that when I was then invited along to photograph a Central Hall, which was one of the old Methodist halls designed to bring industry and culture to the industrial masses. That then led me down to the fish dock, and I just want to play this little BBC video to you, because on the morning that I sent that book off, I sat there watching the BBC News half an hour later and heard them talking about the Casbah and the local people saying it doesn't exist. And I thought, have I made a bit of a mistake? So let me just play this. It only lasts for 3 or 4 minutes, but it gives you some concept or background to what the Casbah and the fish dock is.
That's good. It was once the bustling heart of Britain's busiest fishing port, but for the last 30 years, the area of Grimsby known as the Casbah has become a picturesque ghost town.
Even many locals don't know the area exists, but now it's hoped that this and other historic landmarks in the town could be saved from further decay. David Tillotto reports.
The huge hydraulic tower was modelled on the architecture of Siena. Grimsby used to be our greatest fishing port. And this was its heart. Known as the Casbah, these Victorian streets are now a ghost town. Hidden behind the fences of the port, many locals don't even know it exists. You've never heard of the Casbah?
No, never.
It's got shops and
Not in Grimsby.
Houses.
Not in Grimsby, no way.
Born and bred, you've never heard of it?
No, never. That's the first thing I said, wasn't it? Never heard of it, no. Never heard of it.
And this is its greatest building, the old ice factory.
It's rather a long time since I've been here, and it's rather a shame that it's in such a state that it is, really.
Mike Sanderson was the last chief engineer. You were here on the final day this was operating?
Yes, I was, yeah.
And that feeling on that last day, what was it?
Well, it's pretty sad, really. Yeah, it was, really.
In its heyday, the refrigerators would produce 1,200 tons of ice a day. What can you do with this building?
I don't know. I mean, it's not like an ordinary building. It was a purpose-built.
And it's now been declared by Europa Nostra and the European Investment Bank Institute to be one of the continent's most endangered heritage sites. The problem is saving decaying old buildings is ruinously expensive. But there has been a thaw in the once rather frosty relationship between the port, which wants to embrace the future, and heritage campaigners such as Vicky Hartung.
So do you two agree now about that?
I think we largely are in agreement.
We are in agreement, absolutely.
There is a...
Has it always been like that?
No, I think there's been a changing attitude over time. I think that's fair to say.
Harmony has broken out.
Yes. It has.
And this is an empty smokehouse, but
Whoa, what a smell. That's an odour, isn't it? And this tarred door is some real Grimsby heritage. The residue of 100 years of some seriously old school smoked haddock.
The heritage, does that matter to you?
God, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Grimsby's, clutching on to the remains of fishing industry.
You care about Grimsby, don't you?
We all care about Grimsby, don't we?
40 years on, there is then some hope that the long decline of this hidden heritage may be coming to an end. David Solito, BBC News, Grimsby.
I started a bit of a discussion earlier when I mentioned that I've
Is
had
it
the
a
best...
discussion or are you in trouble?
I'm in a bit of trouble. I mentioned that the best fish and chips I've ever had, which is just personal opinion, were in Grimsby.
And people disagree.
People are defending their own fish and chip shops in
Which
various
is
parts of the
probably
country.
fair enough, isn't it? You'll have to...
So we'll leave them to argue over fish and chips. We all know that. I mean, that's the conversation earlier on about different areas. Fish and chips in Grimsby is, of course, haddock and chips. I moved up from Essex where it was all cod and chips. And one occasion after I'd lived up here for a couple of years, I went back down to Essex and my mum said, do you want to go and get some fish and chips? And I said, yeah, okay. So I went to the local fish and chip shop and just ordered what she told me to order. And when the lady asked for £23, I thought, what the heck have I ordered? The price difference is phenomenal. A family of 4 in Grimsby will have their fish and chips for about under £10, whereas down in Essex it's probably double that. So I don't know what it's like in your area. But you can imagine that when I saw that, literally 30 minutes after I'd sent the book design off to the printer to be printed, I thought, what have I done? Have I made a big mistake? But no, the Casbah is an area. So what we're looking at now is Central Hall. Central Hall in Grimsby still exists in the same way that it did when they were first built in around about 1900. The John Wesley Methodist Church raised, I think it was £1 million guineas to build these different buildings. The big one is, of course, in Westminster, the Central Hall. I think they built at that time about 100 throughout the country. There's only 16 of them still operating in a similar way, and Grimsby is one of them. Although, of course, they do now serve beer and drink. And back at the when they were first built, they wouldn't have been drink, I'm sure, on the menu because Methodists don't. Going back to Colin, he's a Methodist. And at the end of the project, I said, I must take you to the pub. He said, I've never been to a pub in my life. He's a very devout Methodist. But that's the building, marvellous building. This is the fish dock, so this is the Casbah. And this was me developing the project. Where was I starting? Where was I finishing? And these two areas are linked by Freeman Street. So you can see that same tower in the background as this building, and literally where I'm stood here, I'm just to the left where you see that auction pew sign. That's where I was stood. So you can see how the two of them are linked. And of course this road now is full of vehicles, but back in the heyday it would have been full of bikes and cyclists and people going into work. The Grimsby Fish Dock was, as that BBC report said, one of the biggest in the world. It lost out in the mid-1970s when the final Cod War, the government gave back the deep sea fishing rights back to Iceland, and since then the fishing industry has just died a death, really. Although that smoking house is still operating, there's quite a few different businesses operating there. We'd originally been invited along by this chap, Steve Maxton. My wife and I run a local, hyper-local community blog, I call it. The Cardiff University really liked it because they like the idea of two ex-newspaper people running an online, and I'm sure you've got one in your local areas, an online newspaper reporting on local stuff. So Stephen invited us along because in 2017 they were looking at closing. They had been given £30,000 to keep themselves going for 3 years. That money had run out, and now Stephen, who was the head of the trustees, was trying to generate some interest in the building to keep it going, really. And you can see those lights in the background. The architecture goes right back to the 1900s. The different levels of design is all in that building. So I saw this. The last person to leave, please switch off the lights. At that time, they seriously thought they weren't going to survive. And literally on the spot, I kind of lost interest in that northern council estate, although I am returning to that project now, and decided to ask if I could make this my project, which I did. Those lights, I mean, how stunning do they look? And this was Howard Mills. He was the manager at the time, and I found his story fascinating because his parents had got married in the hall in 1936. They were the first people who got married there. Obviously the reception, they didn't get married there, but the wedding reception was there. So he'd got a massive history with the Central Hall, which he was able to tell me about. So these stories, which we're all just walking around in our heads with, are just fascinating stories. I then saw this wall. These were all the events that they were holding. And I just thought, what a marvellous thing to photograph. Messiah, the John Ellis Quartet, the Shadows, obviously what do they call them, copy band or whatever. But then you've got the WEA, absolutely fabulous little stories all to photograph to create this project, all going on behind those doors, which nobody really knows about unless they're involved in them. So I think I probably spent 6 months, 5 to 6 months, just going backwards and forwards, taking these photographs. And in the end, I think I took over 8,000 images, but I'm not going to show you them all tonight because we probably haven't got time. Children were there in the orchestras. This was a local group called Strings. And you can see, and this was all about giving the children something to do. And they really, really did enjoy it. The lady on the left, she's just received, I think, an MBE. Her name is Susan Hollingsworth, I think. And she's a very professional conductor. So it kind of gave, can I say, normal people a chance to work with real professionals. And the productions they were producing were very, very professional. This I thought was quite an interesting concept. The group on the right, they were a male choir who had come over from one of the mining villages, the ex-mining villages in Derby. And the mining choir, obviously the mine has gone now, but the choir has gone over to Central Hall for absolutely decades and decades. And the ladies make the lunch for them. And if you look there, you can see that round the table on one occasion is the men, and then on the other occasion is the ladies. And I said to one of them afterwards, I observed that you ladies didn't eat until the men had ate. We said, oh no, we never do that. And I just found that quite novel for today's age, really. But they keep up these traditions, which was really fascinating. I spoke to obviously the choir, but also the audience as well. These two ladies, when you actually add the number of years that they've been going to Central Hall, it comes to over 80 years. They've been going since they were very, very young. And the stories they were able to tell me were really fascinating. The male choirs, I got totally confused at one point over who I was photographing. They seemed to have about 5 different choirs and orchestras all at the same time. It was so hectic. And this is in a deprived, what is a deprived area of Grimsby now. It's called East Marsh, and East Marsh is apparently the second most deprived area in the country. It used to be very wealthy, of course, when the fish dock was in full operation. The Stamp Club. This is the Stamp Club. They're not fighting. I don't know what they're doing. Probably arguing over the value of the latest stamp collection. But all these different activities were going on there. And this is the president of this chain of office. The Model Railway Club, hidden right up in the attic. This Model Railway Club have had that room for over 50 years. And each year they build a different track. So all these different activities I was able to photograph. And whilst I was up there, I looked out of the window, and this was where the flats came in. There were 5 iconic high-rise blocks of flats in Grimsby, and I kind of heard something which I didn't really like the idea of. Now, I'll be honest with you, I had shot portraits in this area, and I don't feel intimidated very often, but I did actually feel intimidated when I went into one of these blocks of flats to take some portraits that somebody had requested. They were quite sort of interesting areas, but what I didn't like was somebody in Central Hall saying, yes, they're gonna knock those down and decant the people. And I kind of thought, how can you decant people? But that was their view, and of course that was because there was a lot of drug issues and crime issues, and a lot of people did blame them on these flats. So I immediately wanted to photograph the flats. I went and had a look at them, wandered around them, and they were due to be demolished very, very shortly, apparently. So I thought, well, that would give another part of the story. And if you just look on the left edge of that picture, you'll see that tower on the fish dock again. So you can see how close all this is, all in one little area. The Saiga House, so these had all been emptied by now. And the council had been paying people to move out, so they had to clear a lot of people away. A whole load of photographs of the flats, just really to preserve them. And I wasn't the only one, a lot of people were doing this. This is just so, literally I took that photograph and turned around and took that picture. Where these concrete bases are, I did do a lot of portraits of people's homes. They were all masonettes, and by now they'd all been demolished. So a lot of people lived in this area at one point. Newspaper stands with all these areas, what they would do is, I mentioned earlier on, this utopian idea that you could buy everything on your doorstep. So a little bit further, I don't know whether you can see it, but yeah, you can just see that building there, and this is that building behind, and this was an old newsstand. And when I started talking about this project in the Grimsby University Centre, which is where I started off, the tutors were saying, oh, we lived there, and I can remember buying our newspapers from that kiosk, etc., etc. So again, this image created a lot of stories for me. I then started photographing the street signs, the shop signs, because I knew that these were all going to go as well. And you can see the House of Holland there. At one point there was all sorts of different shops servicing those people who worked on the fish dock. And I kind of just wanted to photograph these signs, just Provident, a major company that used to work there or be based there, the Home Shop, all these different shops which used to service the area. I just wanted to document. And also the design. I was looking at this clever design on the walls. People have put a lot of money into this sort of thing, so that kind of shows what the area was like at one point. Freedom Centre building for the future. So I think when you photograph social documentary projects, you kind of can't take enough photographs. All these tell a story of the history of an area. Here we're kind of saying it's 15 minutes to the town centre. well, actually, do you know what? Freeman Street used to be the town centre, really. You had Marks and Spencer's there, and Marks and Spencer's at that period, it probably hasn't got the same draw now, but certainly in the 60s and 70s, if there was a Marks and Spencer's, other businesses would follow. So Freeman Street, a lot of people will say that was the centre of the town, but by now they'd built a new shopping precinct in a different part, which was a 15-minute walk from where I was. So this is Iceland, which had taken over the old Marks and Spencer's. And this chap here, Mike, is a pal of mine from Caister, and he'd worked in that industry. So again, when I spoke to him about what I was doing, he said, well, I'll come along with you. And he was again able to tell me loads and loads of stories about the frozen food and the fish industry. So I've got kind of material coming out of my arms. Tina, where you can see where Mike is there with Iceland. You can see Iceland through the window there. This is the market, the Freeman Street Market. And like I was talking about, when the newspaper editor used to send me out to villages like Stock, I would go to the pub. I went and bought a cup of coffee for 65 pence. And Tina started telling me her story. And she wanted to pose like this because she runs a gymnast club for youngsters. And she actually wanted to move that club. It's out of town at the moment, but she wanted to move it to Freeman Street. And whilst I was there, this chap walked up and he was just absolutely fascinating. He's been going to to the Freeman Street Market for something like 70 years, since he was a 5-year-old boy. And the stories he came out, which I recorded in that Daniel Meadows fashion, the amount of stories that he told me were absolutely superb. So you can see how I'm really getting into the area, this social documentary concept of looking at the urban landscape and how people respond to it. So the market there used to be outdoors, it's now indoors. I think it will survive this sort of redevelopment because it has got such a strong history. But what they'll end up selling is a different matter. The White Knight was the local pub. That's now gone, but one of the couple of tutors at Grimsby, they had grown up in that building. The Freeman Street Shopping Centre, all gone now. Whilst I was there, and this was quite interesting, when you talk about street photography, this is one of the reasons why I use the Olympus EM5, or EM1 now. It's a small camera. Photojournalism really emerged in the 1930s with the new small cameras like the Eminence and the Leica that enabled people just to disappear into the background. Now, when I was doing that degree, finishing off at Lincoln, they wanted people to experiment. So they got me to take a big camera. They thought I was going to take a 5x4, but I went with a Canon 5D. I borrowed it from the university stores, and I asked for the biggest white lens they've got. So they gave me a 70-210 lens. At that point, I've been wandering around like that for probably 4 or 5 months with my little Olympus. Nobody had bothered me. The second I stepped out of my vehicle, taking this picture of the Freeman Shopping Centre with the Canon and the big white lens, and I'd also gone with a big Billingham bag over my shoulder. I was surrounded by a group of teenage boys, all on bikes. What are you photographing, they said. So suddenly I was advertising myself as a photographer. So maybe one of the key elements of doing street photography is just to merge. Just use a small camera and just merge in the background, trying to be unnoticed. But they were talking about the Freeman Shopping Centre. They were great lads, and they said to me, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm just taking pictures of the shopping centre there." And they heard my sort of southern accent, and they said, "Are you from London?" I said, "No, I come from Lincoln University." "What, all that way?" they said. I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "We don't like school. We got kicked out, so they're going to send us to the Grimsby Institute instead." I said, "Oh, well, school's not for everybody, is it?" And I think because I was quite relaxed with them, they then started telling me all sorts of stories. And they said, "You know what, we've been in that place. It's fabulous inside. It really is superb." And they then wanted to show me the window that they climbed in and out of. And at that point, I thought I'd better sort of escape. So I said, well, I better move on. Thank you very much. But yeah, so the local characters used to sort of go in and use it as a bit of a play centre, I think. So this guy, Ian, in Salisbury, he was the guy who showed me around the Casbah. Now, Ian actually is in lockdown in Canada at the moment because he'd been on holiday there when all this kicked off and he couldn't get a flight back. So he's actually over there. But he's the son of the family who used to own the cafes on the Casbah. And he's still got a unit there where he makes furniture and equestrian work. But he invited me down. So it was him that told me about the Casbah in the first place and took us around, walked us around, showing us the different buildings and the different alleyways and tracks and telling us the story and the history of this area. The Grimsby Fish Company, obviously that particular building is no longer in operation, although as I say, there are some. And then he started showing me around his family's cafes. This was one of them, which obviously is closed up. They're all closed up now. But at one point, they had 5 cafes on this square mile called the Casbah, which were all packed full of fishermen and people associated with the fish industry. Absolutely packed. He said it's phenomenal. You saw that on the BBC film track earlier on. So that was the main place. That was the main cafe. And in fact, the Casbah has got security gates that you have to get through. And so when I pulled up at the security gate, the chap said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Oh, Solly's Cafe." And that seems to be the entrance card. If you mention Solly's Cafe, it's so famous, they let you straight on. This is in one of the cafes, which, as I say, he now uses to build furniture and make equestrian attire. So you can see how things have changed. Whilst I was photographing the Casbah, I was still going to Central Hall, photographing the events there, finding them absolutely fascinating. So although the project was in 3 parts, really, the gentrification of the 5 iconic blocks of flats, the demolition of them, Central Hall, and the Casbah, all 3 of them were kind of triangulating to make the one story. I also went in some other local venues, such as the Martial Arts and Boxing Club, and that all became part of the project as well, because when I was speaking to the manager of one of these, I said, "Well, why'd you do this?" He said, "Because our children have got nothing to do. So we hold these clubs just to keep them off the streets, really." So it's kind of a really difficult place, as many places are, to bring your children up. What is there for them? And then the flats, the demolition started, people have been moved out, it's now all fenced off. And so I just took as many photographs as I could, and then the diggers moved in. And this kind of photograph here, to me, really encapsulates the whole story. You've got the youngster there, what would he be, about 20, on his bike. I'm making up stories. The stories might not apply to these 2 people. They're really just semiotic of what I was discovering. So there he is, possibly unemployed. Previously, there would have been no lack of work for him in this area. Now there's very little work. And then there's the chap in the background, somebody similar age to myself, who this has all gone on and we've hardly even noticed it happening. So he's sort of walking along there almost with his head held down. The demolition was absolutely, it happened so quickly. I was going back each week, and in the end I started going back every 2 or 3 days because the landscape was changing so rapidly. But they literally moved these big machines in and demolished from the top. It wasn't one of these blow them up jobbies and they all fall over. They literally crunched them away from the top downwards, but at such a pace, it was fascinating. So, and then they moved on to the actual, the precinct, the shops that supported those flats to clear the whole area. And this again, I took this photograph because as I looked through, somebody had left their children's little car, and I just thought that was sort of so, that told that story about this big truck moving in, this big digger destroying it, and then the little, probably little girl's car, I should think, looking at the colours and the name on it, but this little toy car. The builders actually invited me on. I did get permission. I walked up and on the first day found the head manager, the site foreman, and said, "Do you mind if I take photographs?" He said, "No, keep coming back. There's my card. If anybody stops you, just show them my card. That's fine." So I was working there with their permission. And this picture here, do you remember I mentioned the Corbusier, this reinforced concrete, that kind of told that story for me. One of the problems with the flats were, and this was talking to some of the builders who'd actually built the flats, some of the actual labourers that I bumped into at that market. And I have no reason to believe they were making up stories. They said they needed to build those flats so rapidly. The building was being built in a factory and then delivered, and they were literally putting it together like prefabricated buildings. And he said sometimes we were meant to have 12 bolts to join them together, but the bolts weren't fitting up with the holes. So sometimes we just cut the bolts off, and whereas it should have had 12, maybe there was only 3 or 4. And that's pretty scary on a big building like that. And that's probably why they moved in the wind. I also bumped into a lot of people, or they came up to speak to me. So was it Diana who said earlier on, how do people react to your camera? Well, these people all came up speaking to me. And this particular chappie here, he'd never lived in the flats, but he had grown up in London and had a cousin who lived in the flats. So from an early age, his cousin had actually been sending him postcards. People used to come to this area and take photographs and create postcards of Freeman Street, and he would get sent them. So, I say the flats, they were built in 1971, I think. So, looking at him, how old would he have been? Probably about 15 or 16 or something then. And his cousin was sending in pictures and postcards of the area. This chap still lives there. I think he'd had a few beers, and when I showed you that photograph of the precinct with the sign in front of it, he claimed to have got that sign, and said, "Come round to my flat and I'll show it to you." But I decided not to do that. But a very jovial character. But you can see how the area is really changing at this point. This chap came up to me and wanted to tell me his story, and he'd lived in the flats, and he could actually see the wallpaper on the flat where he used to live with his wife and daughter. But his big gripe was that they'd separated, and his ex-wife had got the money to move out, so he wasn't very happy with the whole thing. And this is the guy who desperately wanted to pose for me, and it took me ages to escape him, but he was pretty keen to have his picture taken, although he did get angry with me when I mispronounced his surname. At that point I thought I was in trouble, and in fact I saw a newspaper story about him a month later where he'd gone into prison for beating somebody up. So you do have to be careful when you're out doing social documentary street photography in these areas. So slowly, or rapidly actually, the landscape changed, and buildings were just being knocked down and destroyed and moved on. And eventually the building ended up like this, just piles of rubble. And of course things do have to change, otherwise we'd still all be living in caves. But it's when you start to talk to the people and hear their memories and history of an area, that there's kind of a sad tone to it all. And even now some of these are left there, you know, the buzzers which people used to press to be allowed into their homes and whatever. And from that came this book, which I really enjoyed producing. It's in the British Library now. They requested some copies of it, and it really did quite well as a degree project. I also produced this little book here. This is like an artist's manifesto, and you can see Martin Parr on there, because I took the book to the Parr Academy when they had the Bill J film, and it's well worth writing that name down, Bill J. On YouTube, you will find that film now. This is Robert and Lizzie, who Robert came with me to that premiere at the Martin Parr Foundation. And I was kind of interested in people's views of the book. So when I got there, I showed it to different people. That's Michael Pritchard on the left-hand side. He's a director of education at the Royal Photographic Society. Martin Parr, and then that's Brian Griffin on the right-hand side. Now, the way they responded to it was Martin Parr, who was hosting the film that night, opened it and said, "I can't look at it at the moment. It'll wind me up too much. It's all about neoliberalism. I'll just lose it." So he has invited me to post him a copy of the book, which I haven't got round to at the moment. Brian Griffin looked at it, and I mentioned his name earlier on this evening when you asked me whether Daniel Meadows was still working. Brian Griffin is most definitely still working, and he immediately turned around and said, "I want to do some work in Grimsby." So there was something that book that interested him. And then Daniel Meadows was there, the guy we started with. And in fact, he spent a good 20 minutes looking through the book and giving me some really interesting feedback to it. So that's what I like about these photo books. You know, you put all your pictures in them and you can take them around and show them to people and create conversations around them. So I think we're back at where we started now. So you can see how talking to Daniel Meadows in the first instance kind of gave me a different perspective on creating photographs. I think before I spoke to him, if you didn't pay me to take a photograph, I probably didn't take any. So I was what you would call a commercial photographer. Daniel Meadows introduced me to the concept of creating personal work and creating bodies of work. And here we are a few years later with me returning with that book to get his feedback on it. So I think we're about there. We are. So any questions on Daniel Meadows at all? Should I think that's the last slide. So should I stop sharing the screen now so we can all unmute ourselves? Neil?
Yep.
Yeah. Brilliant. There we go. We're back.
And we have a question from Martin.
Stewart, with books, which figure very significantly.
Yep.
Photography to some extent is you and your camera, and you're not working with other people or sharing with other people. So the book tends to be your exclusive work, isn't it?
How do you mean, Martin?
Well, you've gone out and taken all those photos and produced a book.
Yep.
Is it a totally solo effort, or do you get some help or speak to people and get their views?
On what's put in the book or after the book, you mean?
Well, you've gone to do the Casbah to Central Hall.
Yep.
You've taken lots of photos and you're starting to put the book together.
Yeah.
At that stage, you think, oh, perhaps I could usefully speak to somebody else before I go to print?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of fortunately married a newspaper picture editor 36 years ago, so Shona does play a part in that, and I do talk to other people, but I don't talk to people that much. I want it to be my book. I know a lot of people do like a picture editor to choose books. In fact, if you go to a publisher, a lot of the publishers want to get in on the act very early to almost control what goes in that book.
Okay.
They're obviously thinking about sales, aren't they? And things like that. But the way I see it is I'm the person who's actually spoken to all those people. I have got that knowledge of the story. How do you actually explain that to somebody else? So sequencing a book is vital. You've got to find a way of putting it together. What I did here was it was almost based on, obviously I went backwards and forwards and made so many trips there, but the final book does actually follow what could be seen as a street photography walk from the Casbah to Central Hall. So it's almost a map of that walk. But no, I kind of wanted to be in control of what went in. And I think the way to develop that skill is just to do some books, really, and see how they develop.
And how long did it take from start to finish to get this book out?
I think probably because of my press backgrounds, where I do everything at triple speed sort of thing, and I'm used to having 5 deadlines in a day, that sort of thing. It doesn't take very long.
Okay.
I'll tend to, I've used desktop publishing since before desktop publishing really came out. So Quark Express I was playing around with,
yeah.
in design now and whatever. So it probably takes me a couple of days to design a book, and then I'll put it to one side and return to it a few days later just to changing it around, thinking why on earth did I put that there and things like that. And then printing is very rapid now. So, when you send the book off, it will come back within a few days. The Casbah Central Hall, that was a little bit different in as much that I went down, it was printed at a firm in Peterborough, and I actually went down as it came off the press, the first book. And actually I've got photographs of me with the printers of it and things like that. So I was able to sort of stand there at the desk and talk to them, and we made a few changes until the final print run went off. Have you produced any books yourself, Martin, at all?
No, not yet. I think like a lot of people, when you see what you've done and the results, it gets you thinking.
Yeah.
And that's why we have presenters like you come along, because you can show like this. I think the key bit comes back to having a project. That's what you had there. So you to get it off the ground and get on with it, basically, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's really what interests you, what you want, how you want to engage with people. I've given similar talks. This talk I put together for you guys, but I've given similar talks on parts of this to all sorts of different organisations, not just photographers. History groups and sociology groups and things like that.
Yeah.
Because they're all interested in these stories.
Yes.
So that's kind of where I take my photography. I'm interested in the concept and the context behind it, what it actually means.
Yeah.
Photography about something in many respects.
Okay.
So it's well worth having a go. And there's different printers. Obviously there's printers like Blurb, if you're just looking at one-offs really. There's a whole load of digital printers out there who will print long print runs. So the latest Park Hill, I think everybody got the work to me on that one, and that was just as lockdown came in, and I wasn't really sure whether to carry on with it, because carry on with the printing at that time, because would the printers be able to do it? And they kept assuring me that they would.
Yes.
But everybody had sent me their money, if you like, so I was spending other people's money. So I kept emailing everybody saying, "What do you think? Shall I order this book?" And they all said, "Yeah. If we have to wait for it, that's fine." But actually, it was back within a week and in the post to everybody, so they all had it within 10 to 14 days of I was saying, "Let's do it." Really. So it's not expensive to do, so it's worth just having a go really and making mistakes. So some of the books I've done where it's just me, and then the other books you can see are collaborative books. So the Camera Club could do a book between you all if you thought about a project to do, and then create a collaborative.
Yes. Is everybody listening to this? Yes.
And the thing is that if you have a defined subject,
yes,
then you can see how everybody responds to that defined subject, if that makes sense. So like Park Hill, I've never said to anybody, this is how you've got to take your photographs, but they know what it's of. So it's of Park Hill, and we've done other projects along those lines as well. The Nottingham Goose Fair, we all went there, and another street fair. So different projects. I think we've done about 4 or 5 different projects. This is all within the East Midlands region with the ARPS. And that really interests me, seeing how people react to the same thing, how they approach it.
Okay, thank you. Lots to think about.
Good. Excellent. Were there any other questions at all?
Yes, I would just like to ask Stewart, with your style of photography, I somehow would imagine you don't spend hours editing, but am I wrong? Is it a question of you like to capture that moment? It's real, it's there, warts and all, or do you actually spend a lot of time editing your images?
I can spend a lot of time because I've used Photoshop since before it was Photoshop. But no, I don't. I use Photoshop in very similar ways to how I would use a darkroom. So if you like, my post-production starts before I take the photograph, how I expose the photograph, knowing that I want to retain detail in the highlights because it's very difficult to recover that from digital photography. It's like shooting transparency. So if you look at the raw files, they always seem a bit flat, but that's so that I can retain that detail. And then I open them and correct that density. And then I'm looking for a black. That's the big thing for me. I want a black. So that little picker on the levels, I'll search for the darkest area of that photograph and set the black mark to it. I'll then set the white mark using the layers again. Sometimes I'll then set a grey level, but often I don't, because I think that's a failing, if you like, or maybe it's just how my Olympus is set up, but sometimes I'll then get a cast. So I then take that cast out. And that's pretty much it, really. Yeah. I will crop an image, so I'm not precious about sort of, but obviously I try not to, because the Olympus is a micro 4/3 camera, so you have got that smaller frame, but the quality is very good. So I've just prepared a panel, and the post-production for 20 images probably took me 2 hours. It took me about 20 weeks to decide on the images, but once I've got there, I post-produced all of them within a couple of hours. I don't want to mess with them too much.
And that's probably what I figured, you know. That's very interesting, thank you.
No, that's fine, thank you. Good question, Maureen, thank you. Yeah. Any other questions at all, or in the projects or general questions? Or are we about there?
It's Alan here.
Hello, Alan.
A question about around the Central Hall and the boxing club and things like that. You're always documenting how they were supporting the community in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Do you ever go back to see if it's developed, how it's going on at all?
I will be going back. Unfortunately, Howard was made redundant, which I thought was a great shame because of his knowledge and experience of the place. And I think because they did make him redundant, that's what's going to make me really interested to go back, because Howard was employed there and he had a staff of about 4 or 5 people who worked very, very hard. And I think their latest cost-saving aspect, obviously needs must, of course, was they made all the staff redundant to rely solely on volunteers. So that, I think, is going to be quite an interesting story. But of course, at the moment, they'll be in lockdown like everybody else. And I think art venues will probably be one of the last things to reopen.
But Central Hall is also a religious building, is it not?
What, sorry?
The Central Hall is also a religious building. They have services still?
It is. There is a fisherman's. They have Sunday services there, so there's a fisherman's chapel there. I don't think it's actually governed or owned by the Methodist Church anymore. I think a trust was set up to preserve it, if you like. So yeah, there's a small element of.
So it's really become more of a community centre now.
It very much has, yeah, very, very much, yeah. So you know, you can rent rooms there. The WEA and the Women's Institute, they all hold their meetings there.
Yeah, I noticed like a Model Railway Club, W3A and all that were there. I also noticed that you looked at the, is it a gym?
Yeah, that's not actually at Central Hall, that's across the way.
Yeah, I realised that, but so they were all working to support the community in some way.
They were, you know, the children. They were saying the children have got nothing to do in the area. There is a sort of nightclub of some description, but that wouldn't really be for the children. So once they finish school at 4 o'clock or whatever, what do? So there were quite a few different clubs aimed at children, boxing, martial arts, and things like that.
But these are not run by the council as such. They're run by individuals pretty well.
Individuals, absolutely, yeah. They're not council run venues. No.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, then I'll pass over to Maureen to say the thanks to Stewart.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Stewart, for your fascinating observations of buildings, which I think are familiar to quite a few of us. I enjoyed especially seeing all your photographic records of the people who moved through those buildings and who continue to move through them in these very changing times. One or two things, I spotted Elsie Tanner early on when, I don't know if anyone else did, a blast from the past, when we were looking, I think it was to do with Daniel Meadows. Yes. And then I certainly enjoyed Colin, the stonemason, and his cobweb tools. I would continue to watch with interest the Park Hill development, especially with HS2 going so close to it. I thought the Siena Tower in Grimsby was, I love that tower in Siena, and it came as quite a surprise to see it. And your Casbah to Central Hall and many of the signs that you captured, signs I think are a real indication of history and how we shopped and how people lived. I think that when you said at the beginning, houses change us, it became, that's something I was thinking about as you presented this evening. But how interestingly that traditions, many traditions continue, that it doesn't really matter where people move to, they will often carry on the traditions that they and their parents have pursued. And yeah, I think that more or less sums up. I found it, yeah, like everyone, a very fascinating presentation this evening. I'd also like to thank Neil once again for co-hosting. And if you could just stick with me for a minute, I just need to talk about something else. That's all right. But many thanks, Stuart.
No, thank you.
Really,
thank you very much.
really
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Thank
We
you.
do a round of applause.
That's very nice of you. Thank you.
Thank you. So you might want to, you may not want to stick around, but anyway. So what I was going to say is about our next Zoom meeting. And as people are beginning to move around more freely, it has been decided that we were going to do our topic on your talk, Stuart, which was going to be urban street photos. But given the situation, but given the bit of flexibility that's out there, I just want to let everyone know that the title of the topic is now Street Urban Thoroughfare, whichever one suits you to do. And our topic slideshow, the Zoom meeting, will take place at 7:30 on Wednesday the 17th of June. Neil is happy, despite what I say in emails, he is happy for submissions the day before, i.e. the 16th of June, and he will send Zoom codes as usual just before the 17th of June. And I think that's all. Is that right, Martin? Have I covered everything?
Diana has something to say as treasurer.
Oh yes,
Okay.
hello, and hello again. I just want to thank everyone who has paid their subs, and we will really look forward to receiving the remainder in the next few weeks, so we can continue with the wonderful programme and work we're doing. But we need the funds, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. there we go. You know, having been treasurer a few years, it does take a little while for the money to trickle through. So we're keeping an eye on it. So and Diana's on top of that.
You're making a good start.
Yes, indeed.
Got some in the coffers.
Okay, thanks, Diana.
Martin, do let me know how you get on with the project as a club. The project that Maureen was just talking about, the street photography project.
Yes, well,
that sounds really interesting.
yes, it will go up on the website, and Neil can let you know about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, with our last talk, I invited her to take a look at the work we've done as the topic. So I will indeed send you a link to it as well.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart.
Yes. So,
Thank you, Stuart.
is there anybody else want to say anything before we sign off?
One quick question. Do we have a presentation for July?
Good question, Alan. I was waiting for somebody to come back to me. They have now come back to me, but they are not sure whether they can do the 1st of July or the 5th of August. But no worries, because I've definitely got something else in the pipeline. But I can't really say much more than that yet until
You've got something up your sleeve.
Yeah, I haven't even got any sleeves, but I've definitely got. I've got 3 people up my sleeve at the moment, actually.
Okay.
It's just so yes, the outlook is definitely good for the 1st of July. It's just confirming one or the other, and I'll let you know by email, everybody, when I know, definitely.
Okay. Well, I think final thank you to Stuart.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And everybody else for attending this evening. I think from this we had about 25, 26, I think.
Yeah.
Neil, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good number. It's slightly up on last time, I think. But anyway, I hope everybody enjoyed it. I certainly did.
Yes, indeed.
And there were things there, like with Grimsby. If you know the area, then you'd be familiar. But that was I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much for the invite. It's been really nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know Grimsby, but it would make me want to go there now.
Another good place is
Right.
Sorry, Anne?
Another good place to visit is Hull.
Hull.
Great place
Hull.
for street photography.
Okay.
Oh, right. Okay, good.
One day we might be able to do that as a society. Yes. Okay. Well, I think it's down to me to say thanks to everybody. Nice to see you all, and hopefully see you all, and perhaps some more at the next evening, where we see the urban street, etc. Pictures.
That's great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night,
guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Cheers, Phil.